Welcome everybody to the latest BASIS webinar. Welcome back to many of you who've contributed to our webinar series in the past, and welcome to those of you joining for the first time. Quite a few people joining for the first time. You are very welcome. These webinars are our attempt as BASIS to keep the conversation about the vital relationship between sport and the environment and sustainability in sport going throughout these periods of lockdown. We've been talking throughout the series to people throughout the sports sector, from the grassroots all the way through to the biggest and most recognisable governing bodies and professional clubs and world-class venues, politicians and everybody who's related basically to delivering a more sustainable footing for sport in operations, in policy, and in communications. And all of our past webinars are available to watch back on our website. I'm sure that one of our colleagues from BASIS will post a link for you to be able to watch those webinars back in the chat. My name's Dom Goggins. I'm the Communications Director with BASIS. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce the session and welcome Jonathan Overend, a very special guest for this week's webinar. Jonathan, as you all know, is one of the most recognisable voices in sports broadcasting, but most recently is responsible for the absolutely amazing Emergency on Planet Sport podcast series. Jonathan, I hope you don't mind me saying it's a wonderful piece of work. It's without doubt for me the best articulation of the risk that climate change poses to sport and the need for sport to wake up to these issues and to be alive to them. I'll ask you all just to be kind and to overlook the fact that as an amateur I am ill-equipped to interview a professional broadcaster in any way, but I'll also ask for your help, because this webinar series is an opportunity for you to have a conversation, and hopefully BASIS can facilitate that. But the chat is open. I encourage you to use it. I encourage you to pose questions or to raise issues that you think are important. As things come up in the chat, I'll make sure they're introduced into the conversation. I'll call on you to ask questions where I can. So please do use it. I'll also introduce Russell Seymour, who's our Chief Executive, the BASIS Chief Executive, at various different times during the podcast, and Russell will close the session with a couple of announcements as well. But let's kick off and get straight into it. Jonathan, as I said, you are one of the most recognisable voices in British sports broadcasting, particularly for somebody like me who's been an obsessive listener to Five Live Sport over the years, recognising you first of all as a kind of correspondent on tour for tennis for the BBC, but also as anchor of the Sunday programme on Five Live, and now involved in various different projects. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and your career and how you came to be such a prominent broadcaster, and then I think we'll dive into the podcast series from there.
Sure. Thanks, Dom. And first of all, thank you to you and Russell and everyone at BASIS for organising this and for inviting me. I'm glad the Nadal-Tsitsipas match is finally over, so I didn't have to delay things. That was a bit of an epic this morning that you may have been following. And hello to everyone on this webinar. Many of you I know. I see some familiar faces and some names from the past there, and lots of people I don't know as well. So great to have this opportunity to speak about this and to engage in conversation. And as Dom says, do post any questions you might have in the chat as we go along. It'd be great to have a chat about things. I suppose a little bit of background first of all as to how this project came about, because a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, was this a subject that you're particularly close to, or is this something that you or your family are massively into?" And I've been very upfront about people on that from the start, because I think it's really important. And the answer has always been no. No, this is not something that I've been passionate about in the past. It's something I've had a close interest in, of course, like we all should have. But, I will be that outsider, if you like, coming into this community to really learn and discover. And I think that was really important in making this series, because what we wanted to do was to take it to a wider audience, to make people aware that the links between sport and climate change are there. They're happening right now. then not to park away for the future for our grandchildren to worry about. They're for us to worry about right now. There are impacts, there are contributions of sport to what's happening, but there are also solutions to be found. So we didn't want it to be a series that was all doom and gloom. We didn't want loads of people coming on saying we're all doomed. We wanted a bit of that. But we also wanted to find those solutions and hear about how different sports and different governing bodies are going about. Not kidding ourselves, there's so much more that needs to be done, absolutely. But by broadening the conversation into making people aware that this is on all of us, but it's about all of us as well, because it's about something we love. It's about sport. It's about the very existence of sport. And I think bringing home, hopefully in some of the stark terms we have in the series, some of the existential threats, I think has really made people sit up and take note. People who weren't necessarily engaged with this topic beforehand, I think are engaged now. And if one more person has become engaged as a result of this, then I guess we've done our job.
Well, you certainly have done a great job, and I think I've spoken to an awful lot of people who are more aware and more engaged and more committed as a result of the podcast series. But I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, and is it something, even if it's not something that was at the forefront of your mind, when you were, for example, when you were following the tennis tour around the world and broadcasting, for various different broadcasters for the BBC, is it something that you were kind of aware of, or is it something that was talked about on those tours, or is it something that you have come to know more about through this project?
Yeah, well, I stopped zigzagging on the tennis tour in 2013, and I'd done 10 years of it. And I have to admit that the amount of flights I was doing every year was on my mind. I mean, I wouldn't be so candid to say that was the reason why I stopped being the BBC's tennis correspondent, but I was away for half the year. And when you look at the tour, I think, Dom, actually, you made the point on the cricket episode in the series about the zigzagging nature of a cricket tour, the last time England were down under, for example. And I do think tennis is a sport as well that can do more to look at its calendar, to look at the way it flies, not just the players around the world, but everyone associated with the tour, and that includes us in the media. If it's asking us to go to Paris one week, New York the next, and then out to the Far East the week after that, it makes no sense at all. And it strikes to the heart of one of the key themes in the series, which is priorities. Where does the fight against the impact of climate change sit in all of our priority list? And why is it not right at the top of our priority list? I mean, it's a really curious one, isn't it? Really curious question. We have logistical concerns, we have commercial concerns, we have operational concerns and everything else. But when are we going to start elevating the risk to our planet to the very top of all of our priority lists? And I think that is something that we can all take from this. I certainly will be.
Yeah, well, it's a key takeaway from listening to the series. It's a question that I think does run through the heart of the whole thing, almost like a thread. And just actually, it's been a question that's come up an awful lot in this webinar series as well. And I think a conclusion that we've come to is that when these decisions, when sustainability becomes a key factor in commercial decisions, is when things will really start to change. But just thinking about the series and the way that you put it together, I mean, it's got interviews with some of the highest profile athletes and some leading administrators and academic experts, as you would expect.
And
series, and me, so I can only apologise for that. But you had to get some amateurs in as well, though, didn't you, Jonathan? But it unfolds as this kind of, it's not just you interviewing people who know what they're talking about. It unfolds as this compelling kind of story that develops throughout 8 different episodes and focuses on different sports and different themes at different times. But it's almost like a work of art as well, with the way that it's put together. It's an experience. It's not just a series of conversations, and it feels like it's intended to kind of stand there without a shelf life. Something that can be referred back to as an important moment, actually, when we started to take these issues more seriously. Was that a deliberate intention, or did it unfold kind of by accident as you were exploring issues?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for all your comments, by the way, Dom. I really appreciated that. But yeah, I mean, the thing about podcasts, and I'm learning more about the podcast world all the time. I've got my own independent production company now, having left the BBC, and the podcast market is just exploding in a way that I don't think even any of us in the audio business thought it would. I mean, I remember doing my first podcast in something that was a tennis podcast, and I did it in about 2007. I mean, 14 years ago, and then it almost feels like the podcast world disappeared for a decade, and now everyone's at it. But the beauty of them is they, you're right, they will sit there and they will be available for the rest of time. So who knows when this series might be at its most popular? It might be in a year's time. It might be in 10 years' time. Who knows? It was really important to make them as timeless as we could. It's not always easy because obviously you've got major events that you want to make references to. But it is a timeless series. It's something people can dip into at any time. And even though there are themes running throughout the episodes, I would encourage you to just dip in here and there. There might be, I'm not going to say sit there and listen to all 8 episodes, because that will take most of your weekend. But just dip in and you'll hear certain themes that I'm sure you've discussed in these webinars you will have going on inside of your own organizations and your own heads. And there's some really interesting points made. The priority list is one. Another one, Dom, that I thought was really interesting throughout many of the episodes, this whole idea of a fear of hypocrisy going on. As to why people in sport shouldn't talk about this, because they don't want people like me in the media with the microphone to put the nasty questions to them, saying, well, that's all very well, but. And that's kind of one of the points that I really want to be open about and really want to make in this, because I haven't got an electric car on the drive. I'm not vegan yet. I'm looking into it. The whole electric car thing's really interesting, and I'm saying my family definitely are heading in that direction sometime very soon. But am I whiter than white in this area? Absolutely not. And I think it's really important that we say to a lot of these athletes who are maybe outside this community, i.e. those who are engaged and interested but don't perceive themselves as experts in this area, we need to say to them, look, it's okay. We understand the fear of hypocrisy. It's totally understandable, particularly if you're a celebrity and if you're an elite athlete. But you're still allowed to have an opinion. You're still allowed to talk about this. And the more that those people can come from the outside, if you like, to engage with this, the most important topic of all, in my opinion, the better, because they can spread that word to their followers. Athletes are influencers. That point has been made numerous times in the series. And one really interesting example was Oriol Romeu, the Southampton midfielder. And I worked really hard to try to get a Premier League footballer to come on the series and do an interview, and it was really hard. It was really hard to do for this very reason. Unfortunately, I know people at Southampton quite well, and really emphasise that point that I've just made, that this is not me saying to Oriol Romeu, what car do you drive? It's me wondering how engaged he is and whether it is talked about in Premier League clubs. And he ended up making a couple of really interesting points. I think he was talking about sustainable clothing and actually saying, well, in my opinion, what's more sustainable than actually not buying the clothes at all when we don't necessarily need them? So it's just these like different things that came at you from different angles that just triggered parts of your brain into thinking, wow, that's actually quite an interesting point. And hopefully some of that came across from members of this community, as I say, but also voices who we don't and haven't heard from in the past on this subject. That was really important.
Yeah, it was important. It was quite a powerful part of the podcast, that actually. And I mean, people who've been on these webinars before might have heard me talk about my contention actually with Premier League clubs about that kind of fear of hypocrisy being something that inhibits them from talking about these issues, in public or with their fans. And actually, I think Southampton are an exception to that rule, where there is a sustainability program that's going on and they are prepared to talk about it. They've recently published a new sustainability strategy and it's impressive, and they don't claim to be perfect. And I think it's really important because I think it shows that, we all have to take sustainability seriously, and we're all somewhere on that journey, and none of us are perfect. But actually, commitment to exploring the issues and working out how we can contribute to something better is the most important thing.
And actually, on that, Dom, just as a further illustration that might be of interest to people, obviously in making the series, we had to do an awful lot of research, and an awful lot of emailing went on. Sort of October, November time, and we approached lots of clubs, lots of governing bodies, and it was really interesting to see what sort of response came back. And it ranged, as you might imagine, from people who said, wow, that sounds interesting, tell us more, down to no reply, and no reply to the follow-up, or possibly we'll look into it. I'm not sure who it is we need to talk to at our organisation about that, but I'll get back to you, and then never getting back to us. So I think that in itself illustrates how much work there is still to do, and how much difference there is between governing bodies. You know, some are really well set up. Some have directors of sustainability, some have sustainability departments. They have, the projects that they're actively working on right now. And others, I get the impression, have absolutely none of that and are so behind on this. There's a lot of catching up to do. But hopefully they will start catching up, and we will, if we ever make a second series of this, get more from other sectors who perhaps previously weren't set up to contribute.
Yeah, no, I think, if you don't mind, actually, I'm going to put Russell on the spot for a second and bring him into the conversation, because Russ pioneered a lot of this work before it was, fashionable to be interested in sustainability in sport, when he was at Lords, and now has this broader role with Basis, working with clubs and governing bodies. Russ, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about whether you think that it is changing, and whether we're at a bit of a tipping point within sport on sustainability, and whether some of the things that Jonathan's just said there about readiness for clubs and for governing bodies to take these issues more seriously is becoming more apparent.
I think it is, certainly from a Basis perspective. In the last 6 months, and certainly since Christmas, there's been far more interest and far more inquiries coming through to us, asking for more information. Is it really a tipping point? I think it's maybe it's approaching that apex as to where it needs to go. I don't think we've got an avalanche coming immediately, if I'm completely honest, but there is far more awareness. And look, there's an obvious issue here. Look, COVID and the lockdown and all the issues that we have with that. Sport has to come back in some way. And potentially there's two ways you can go from this kind of massive, almost unprecedented in recent times, this massive event that we've been living through for the last 9 to 12 months. And you can either go back into your comfortable position, and that will be fully understandable if clubs and venues kind of say, well, look, we can't make changes at the moment. We've been hit financially. We've got staffing issues because of, we've had to put people off, et cetera, et cetera. So there could be a real need maybe to go back to a comfortable position and where we were before. And there may even be a little bit of retraction from this. And I've been talking to a couple of people over the last few days about plastics rather than climate change. But plastics is clearly a big issue. We've talked about it many times on these podcasts. And there's a concern in some venues around public perception and hygiene of reusables, which I can understand why, but a reusable container is absolutely as hygienic, as clean, as ready to use as a single use would be. So possibly we'll go back to that comfort position and possibly maybe regress slightly. But these sorts of opportunities, these massive impacts can also mean you can come back differently, and you can come back with innovation. You can come back with something, because look, if nothing else, people may not remember what was happening before, and you come back with this new normal, which I know is a phrase that's been used so many times, but you can come back and do something different and do something ambitious. But I think it's probably a minority of clubs that are looking at that ambition and coming back, probably just because of capacity. Having said all of that, I think that over a relatively short term, clubs and venues will be looking at this much more seriously. And then the next year to 18 months, I think maybe we will see that point turn and we will get that avalanche of interest. That's certainly what I hope for anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. Well, we all hope for that. And just an interesting point actually raised by Zena about the hypocrisy argument in the chat being about the fact that it's linked to guilt, or and the guilt isn't a particularly good impetus for change. And actually, we need much more positive messages and empowering messages. And returning to the series, Jonathan, I think that really does come through, particularly in the last episode, which is much more solutions focused rather than focusing solely on the problem. Although that does, the solutions and the fact that solutions are there comes throughout the series. But just thinking about the series and the way that it unfolded, and this is just my opinion, my take on it. People might listen to it and feel something different, but at the start, it felt like something that you were interested in and a really important conversation that you wanted to facilitate. And throughout the series, it felt to me like something changed in the way that you were talking about these issues. I don't know if that's right, but for me, the kind of penny drop during the golf episode, I was out for a run when I was listening to that episode, and I had to stop running and just listen to it because it was quite powerful when you were at Montrose, and your testimony almost of standing on the cliff edge, looking at stakes in the sand that were 30 or 40 meters away on the beach, which were where the tee box used to be. And did something change inside you during the series?
Yeah, I mean, that really shocked me when because I did virtually all these interviews for the series, and we did about 30 of them remotely over Zoom like this. But for the golf episode, I really wanted to see it for myself because I'd read your report, Dom, that you were part of, the Game Changers, and hearing about what was happening on that particular stretch of East Scotland coastline, and I thought, okay, I need to see this. So before the second lockdown, I headed up there. And yeah, you hear on the news, don't you, about this stretch of coastline lost half a metre in 5 years or whatever it might be. And you kind of think to yourself, half a metre in 5 years, whatever, not my land. But then you see it for yourself and you see that it's much greater, much more urgent, 2 metres per year. They're losing there. And literally, I mean, we tried to get this across, and it's not always easy in an audio format to get this across quite as starkly, but there are teas that are just not there anymore, and there are the newer teas where only half of them exist, and stretches of fairway that are effectively on the beach. And this is happening rapidly. And if you think about the existence of golf, certainly in this country, the very nature of the Open Golf Championship is that it's played on links golf courses. What are links golf courses? They hug the coastline. They're like Montrose. They're on the sea. Montrose is just up from Carnoustie, which is just up from St Andrews. This is one of the most famous golfing stretches of coastline in the entire world. So what are we doing about this? I mean, I'm kind of looking around myself in Montrose here thinking, what's happening? Where's the concern? I'm looking at groups of golfers out there merrily going about their business, and they'll be having a pint later and they'll be coming back to play next week. But what about their children? What about their grandchildren? At this rate, this golf course isn't going to exist. And that's not scaremongering. That's the trend, and that is the evidence. So yeah, I mean, you talk about the penny dropping. I think it kind of did it at that moment. And in terms of the solutions, I'd go back to something Russell said a moment ago about the adaptability of all of us during COVID. I remember speaking for another series actually in the summer to Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson, and she was making the point that for years disabled people have been asking to work from home. Can we please work from home more? It would make our lives so much easier. And it doesn't happen. And then a bunch of able-bodied people, because of COVID, want to work from home, and suddenly it happens in all our organisations, just like that. So what does that tell us? It tells us something negative about what we were previously set up to do, but it also tells us something positive about the speed of the way we can adapt. So if we can adapt that quickly to a global pandemic like COVID, surely we can also adapt to something that in the long term is going to have greater ramifications. Would I be right in saying that? Climate change, almost certainly. So I think it's got to get us thinking. It's got to get us thinking radically, and it's got to get us thinking now as well, to put forward conversations that maybe 12 months ago might have been seen as ridiculous. Could you have the Olympic Games in the same place for the rest of time? Madness. Not anymore. Surely.
Yeah. And that's a point that Melissa Wilson, the British rower, raised on one of the podcasts, I think, about having the Olympics in the same place in the future. I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree that climate change over the long term is going to be an even bigger crisis, much more systemic crisis than COVID has been. I think something we have talked about on this series is whether it is possible or how easy it's going to be to convince people that a slow burn crisis like climate change is as urgent as something which is more immediate and much more stark, like and in your face, like COVID. But just actually, you're talking about solutions and thinking about that the golf episode, and whether we are taking these issues seriously enough. You talked to Steve Isaac from the RNA as part of that episode, and the RNA, I think we'd all recognise, are doing some great work on this. Do you feel, I mean, at a governing body level, it really came across that the commitment was there? But he said that the key thing was to engage the sport, so the people who run the sport, which is the people who run individual golf clubs. Do you get a sense, having had that conversation and having visited Montrose and, just from your experience in sport, do you get a sense that commitment will grow as people start to see these issues more starkly? I think it's still a bit in balance.
I hope so. I mean, you're right about the RNA. They were brilliant from start to finish, and I was really impressed with the way they were so open and honest about this. This is a subject they want to talk about, and that's the big difference between some governing bodies and other governing bodies. Other governing bodies might run scared when you bring up this topic. Why? Don't know. Well, look at the RNA. Look at the FIA in Formula One and motorsports. Another really interesting case study there. Will golf wake up to the urgency? I don't know. It depends whether golfers and golf clubs take the long-term view, because at the end of the day, we're all just looking out for tomorrow, aren't we? And we're looking out for where our next round might be. I mean, I don't play myself. I know you do, Dom, and you're pretty handy, aren't you? But we need to change that short-termism into worrying about where our kids are going to play golf in the future. Are they going to be able to play cricket on the weekend if the rain trends continue? In South Asia, in South Africa, all the problems they've had with water shortages there around cricket seasons. Are kids going to be able to play the game out there? Are we going to be able to play tennis in the height of summer in Australia? Is the Australian Open sustainable at this time of year, in the height of summer, the temperatures they've been experiencing? All these questions, we've got to bring it really to the future generations and think that if these trends continue, where might we be? When is breaking point? Who decides when breaking point is? And what happens when breaking point arrives? Because this isn't just about elite sport. This is about recreational sport. There'll be people out in Melbourne right now, as Nadal plays Tsitsipas this morning. They've got all the medical backup they need backstage, if God forbid anything were to happen to them. But there'll be recreational players down the road hitting in the same sort of temperatures who might collapse with no medical support anywhere near. So we've got to think about the future generations in this and think more long term for sure.
It's an interesting point, actually. And you mentioned Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson. She's the trustee of SLQ Sports Leaders, and Richard Norman, who's the CEO of SLQ Sports Leaders, has asked about what potential, this is in the chat, what potential young people supporting active change in sustainability can deliver. And was that a big part of the conversations that we were having in putting this together, about how engaging young people, be it from the commercial interest of the sport or just in terms of the future pyramid and the pathways to elite levels and making sure that quality exists into the future? Did that feature in your conversations putting this together?
Well, golf. Steve Isaac, who you mentioned from the RNA, was again quite open about this. He said if we want to attract younger people to play golf, and that's absolutely essential for them as a sport, they need new audiences, they need younger audiences. They've got to engage on something like climate change, because that is absolutely at the top of many young people's agendas. And then we heard from Jamie Chadwick, the young motor racing driver. She was on one of the episodes. She, a bit like me, said when she linked up with the Extreme E series. She wasn't massively aware of the issues, but now she is. She's educating herself all the time. She's finding that when she goes out of London to do her training, the air quality is so much better, and she's able to do so much more. And it's these sort of little things that hit home. But absolutely, this is. I mean, I've got two young daughters, a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and this is right at the top. That's the doorbell. I hope that's not important. This is right at the top of their agendas and their school friends, and they kind of look at what's been happening and think, well, why hasn't it been top of your agenda all your life, you 48-year-old, whatever you've done to the planet that we've got to enjoy in the future. So absolutely, I think it's vital that organisations engage with these young people, not just because they're the future of the sport, but this is what they care about, and we owe it to them to do more on this topic.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were saying about what's it going to take, and thinking about the story that you told about Amy Steele, or that Amy Steele told about her experience with heat stroke, the netball player, and Lucy Safarova's experience of playing in extreme heat, and the reference that was made to Djokovic and his Instagram post about watching an egg actually frying on a practice court in Melbourne, and then the example of the US swimmer Fran Crippen who died in the water. And just thinking about your professional background and your experience, I imagine you've sat in countless editorial meetings when you're deciding together what you're going to cover and who you're going to speak to. Do these kinds of issues ever come up as something that you would want to cover in Main Street broadcasting, or that where there is an editorial demand to cover these issues or to ask athletes about these issues, or is that still not quite cracked that bit yet?
Yeah, I don't think we've cracked that. I mean, looking at the list of attendees on the call, we've got a former colleague of mine on the call who actually was very high up at the BBC until he left a few years ago. So maybe he could offer a thought on that. But no, I don't think this has come up that much at editorial meetings. I think it's starting to, but again, I think maybe big organisations like the BBC are perhaps like some of those governing bodies I talked about, playing catch up a little bit. They do have sustainability directors now in the various departments. I know BBC Sport has signed up to the United Nations Sport for Climate Action framework, but yeah, I don't think in terms of the way that we have questioned governing bodies or athletes in the past has ever been dictated by climate issues. No, I do think that is changing.
Well, let's hope it does change. And actually, I think governing bodies can help to change that. Chris Whitaker is the chair of the BASIS board, and he also works for ECB. And he's talked a little bit on the chat about how optimistic he is. And he's talked in webinar series in the past about that. Chris, can I just put you on the spot just so you can introduce your thoughts on where that hope and that optimism comes from?
So this is in another program that I support, which is a young leader program in cricket. So these are 14, 15-year-olds. And part of what we offer them is, so it's training them to become volunteers, basically. And one of the modules is around groundskeeping and environmental awareness. And they've left on the environmental awareness bit because they can see the relationship between the surfaces that they play on and the environment and what it takes to prepare that surface. Obviously, you're taking grass and cutting it down to within a millimeter of its life to play a game of cricket on, and obviously that requires all kinds of machinery and stuff. And they get the link, they understand, and I think that's where you're going to make the difference, because that's where you're going to get the conversations going. And I thought Richard Parker talked about recreational sport is actually where the massive opportunity to change conceptions about sustainability really exists, because there's hundreds of thousands more people playing sport on a weekend than there are in the professional game. So that's kind of where my optimism is. I've got a question for Jonathan. So this is a big one, bit of a curveball. But do you think that the reason the sport is so far behind in kind of embracing the whole issue around sustainability is because it's a patriarchal sort of environment, and that if women had been running sports, we would have been far further down the line of embracing sustainability.
Wow, that is a curveball. Quite possibly, Chris. What I would say on that is, wow, you've really thrown me with that one. I think it's taking too long for a number of reasons, but one is just the fundamental reason that we just expect sport to happen, don't we? We turn on the TV this morning and we want to watch the tennis. We want to watch Rafa Nadal at the tennis. We're sitting back, in lockdown, cup of coffee in hand, watching a great match. Are we really that interested in what's going on inside that athlete's body? Are we really that interested in what the radiant temperature is around the court? No, we just want to be entertained. And then we want to watch the test match next week to see if England can move 2-1 ahead against India. Okay, it's a day-nighter. Okay, the fourth test, it might be raging heat for the fourth test. Do we massively care about that? Do we care about the impact or the extra equipment is put on these athletes in those radiant temperatures? We expect it to happen. We want it to happen. We demand to be entertained. And that's where I think if we can all just think a little bit deeper as people who care about sports fans, then we can make some ground on this.
Yeah, and then that could happen in the commentary and the commentators talking about it, so it becomes like, heat. Oh well, that actually means there's a problem, and that becomes interwoven into the conversation.
I think you're right. Yeah, because actually, the for anyone who's heard it, the episode that Dom was referring to that we made with Amy Steele, the netballer, it was interspersed with the science of what was actually happening in her body at the time. And Amy emailed me afterwards to say that was the first time that she had actually heard someone who really studies these things give her an explanation as to what happened to her that day. So I think, as you say, that sort of commentary around the impact of extreme heat or climate change impacts will really help with people's understanding and get them to appreciate more, what it is that we're being entertained by.
So the science in that episode was provided by Mike Tipton from University of Portsmouth, and Mike's thinking underpinned the Hit for Six report, which was the report that Basis produced during the last Ashes series, which is available on the website actually. And Mike's expertise was phenomenally important in us producing that piece of work. Just picking up, Chris, you mentioned the broadcast side of things, and going back to that editorial question, Jonathan, Joe from Sky is on the call and is talking about Sky Sports having a monthly editorial meeting to talk about climate change. Joe, do you mind if I put you on the spot and ask you to unmute yourself and just talk about that for a minute, and just the kind of issue?
I know David's with us as well, David Garrido, who former colleague of mine who does great work in this area as well on Sky Sports News. So yeah, anything they'd like to add.
Hi Jonathan, good to see you. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So David, you covered the sustainability league table, I think, a week or so ago, didn't you? I wonder if we can hear from Joe about the editorial side, and then if you can.
No, you go first.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Sorry to steal the limelight there. So Sky Sports, we were the first broadcaster to sign up to the UNFCCC, and part of that is to make sure that you are using your voice to share what's going on. So Sky Sports has for a while now had monthly meetings to talk about how we are going to include climate change in our editorial. So exactly like you're saying, get the commentators to talk about it, frame the shots appropriately so that we can see the solar panels on the roofs, so that we can talk about the, if the lawnmower is electric, things like that, that we can normalize some of the conversations. We've also trained all our editorial staff and commentators, reporters, presenters to feel comfortable about climate change, making them aware of it. And we, of course, this aligns with our Sky Zero strategy. So it is absolutely more to come from Sky.
That's very, very welcome indeed. And David, you're on the presenting side, and is this something that you're starting to see seep through into the broadcast side of things?
I really hope so. This is part of what I'd like to drive towards. Before I answer that directly, I just really want to congratulate Jonathan on what a brilliant piece of work that was. I'm a very, very acute, critical listener, and I thought it was just brilliantly delivered. Really, really well done. And also, given my kind of, I suppose, upbringing and training in broadcasting, I spent a long time on radio on Newsbeat, and we always prided ourselves on high production value. And again, that's just top level. So as it says with 9419, high impact journalism, high spec audio, it really is all of those things. So brilliantly well done. Bravo, Overs, really, really well done.
Thank you, David. That's very kind, and thanks, Joe, as well. I mean, that's really good to hear. You know, as a broadcaster myself, who's worked for so many years at the BBC, to hear that another organisation is actively thinking in those terms is really, really encouraging. I think, to actually brief commentators, make them feel at ease discussing this subject, and to even just think about the framing of shots to normalise things like solar panels and electric vehicles. You know, well done. I mean, that's a brilliant step, and I really hope that other broadcasters can hear about that and implement that themselves, because you're clearly a leader in that area. So well done.
Yeah, we also want to work with the governing bodies and the venues as well to tell us about these stories, because we've got a lot of airtime to fill. So anything that we can bring in to help that.
A lot of channels as well, Joe. A lot of channels.
Yeah.
To answer your question, Tom. I'd like to think that the conversation is becoming normalised. I posted on my LinkedIn a little clip of myself with a co-presenter, Bella Shah, on Sky Sports. He's on deadline day. You know, two of the biggest days of the year, a deadline day for us on Sky Sports News. We've kind of made it as much as we can do our appointment to view, if those things can still exist. And talking about how we've been dressed in all sustainably sourced clothing. And that's just the first, I suppose, it's the entry point really for us. And I think that there's so much more that really can be done. And I think that Sky's got a big commitment to this whole area. And we're also aware that we need to walk our own talk on it too. And so the best way to do that is to really combine the campaign with the editorial and make these things that we talk about more and more frequently on air. So I've started off doing a few little bits and bobs. I've written a piece about the Waste Management Phoenix Open, which, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure that there are some golf specialists in the room anyway, but it's known for three things. One is that it's the biggest event in golf in terms of attendance, 700,000 over the week at the Phoenix Open. The second thing is the stadium hole, the 16th, entirely encased in grandstand stadia. And it's a par 3, so after you've hit your tee shot and before you stride onto your green to hopefully putt for birdie, if you've hit your tee shot way left or into a bunker, you'll be greeted by boos, and if you've done well, you'll be greeted by cheers, and it's got this sort of unique feel about it. But also USP number 3 is that it's the greenest show on grass, and they have so many things that they do, and they do really well to engage a young audience on it. And they've got a they when they had crowds in before COVID, they had a hashtag which was been there, done that. It's about bins and recycling, and they're trying to kind of encourage people to share creative ways of recycling. I don't want this to sound Mickey Mouse or anything. I think it's just important to talk to people and connect with people in a language that is right for them. And young people are already, I think, a bit more sensitive and connected and engaged with this topic. So hopefully that's a positive thing, and they will respond well. But there's plenty more we can do. I think the tone of the conversation we need to have is important. Not be too preachy, and try and make it engaging and be creative, like Jonathan has been with his series. Find inventive ways of hooking people in. I mean, the Montrose episode, which was obviously recounted first person, was so I can still hear it now. It was just so telling, so chilling in some way. And I think you can also lighten the tone and find creative devices that way around as well. But I don't want to dominate the conversation, so that's it for me.
Not at all. No, it's really interesting. And actually, not that these webinars are a vehicle for my opinion or anything like that, but the Arizona example I think that you've given is an interesting one, because I've often thought, if you think about the 4 majors in golf, 3 of them have got a clear identity. The Open is the oldest, the longest standing. The Masters is the Masters, the most iconic. The US Open is the toughest test, and the PGA doesn't really have an identity. I've often thought that USPGA is missing a trick by not having that, you know, making sure that those venues move around to the most sustainable venues, and that is the thing that tournament becomes known for. But anyway, I'm not sure anybody from the USPGA is on this call, so that's maybe for another day. So switching just from the production and the broadcasting side of sport, I'm going to put somebody else on the spot now as the focus of sports broadcasting. Melissa Wilson, I mentioned earlier, actually is on the call. Melissa, if you don't mind contributing to the discussion, you were a big part of the podcast, and you also were responsible for a breakthrough moment last year when you organised over 300 British Olympians to write to the Prime Minister in support of a green recovery from COVID. Just wondering if you want to share a few of your own perspectives about, you know, being on the elite level of sport and, you know, hopefully competing in Tokyo. And I think something that you've said on the podcast and in other places is that, you know, you've asked your parents not to go out there because you would feel it would be excessive for them to take a flight halfway around the world to watch you compete for 6 minutes. You also raised the possibility of the Olympics taking place in one place permanently on that, you know, rather than being a cycle around the world. I just wonder if you'd be interested in sharing a couple of perspectives on, you know, taking part in a podcast, but also your approach to these issues more broadly.
Yes, well, as several people have said already, just thank you to Jonathan, because as something to listen to, I found the podcast such a useful resource, just understanding. I think part of what's still the journey we're on is joining the dots and working out who's doing what and who's best placed to do what. And I think resources like this are just so useful for understanding what's already going on in this space. I guess the main reflection that I came away with after the letter was that it demonstrated to me that there was a lot of willingness within the athlete community to speak out, at least to a certain extent, on these issues, and high profile athletes as much as people with kind of maybe athletes with maybe a more modest profile, because we had over 40 Olympic and Paralympic champions and real kind of household names who were happy to email back and say, yeah, no, this matters to me really more than anything now. I am thinking about my children and my grandchildren and things like that. But it felt to me like in order for those voices to really be as powerful as they could, we needed to look quite seriously at how to address the hypocrisy element. And I think that, to me, is where there's real scope for progress to be made in these coming weeks, months, potentially years. But because of the timescale pressure of these issues, it's kind of how quickly things can be done. But I think there is just huge potential when you've got athletes who can be role models and can be really powerful spokespeople for these issues, and carry a lot of coverage with their fans and spectators. But in order to really unlock that potential, I think that it's going to be hugely valuable for NGBs and organisations like the BOA and the IOC to start really backing big projects and real movements, so that athletes can stand up and say, this is an issue I care about, and that's reflected in the work that my national governing body is doing. So that's I'm with an organisation called Champions for Earth, and I think that's going to be our focus for the coming period of time, how we unlock athlete potential, but via what national governing bodies and the like are doing.
I think when that does happen, when the big shifts really do start to take place, you'll be able to look back on your own contribution to achieving that with enormous pride as well, Melissa. And we're all hoping and wishing you well for Tokyo this summer, assuming that it happens. Jonathan, just back to you. Thinking about this conversation and what you're hearing, and thinking about your experience putting together the podcast and all of those conversations that you had, do you come away from all of this feeling kind of hopeless, or do you feel more hopeful that change can be achieved and we can start to take these things more seriously?
No, definitely more hopeful, Tom. Absolutely, and thanks, Melissa, by the way, for all your support on this project. You know, you were one of the first people I spoke to about it, and you were unfailingly positive from the word go, and it was absolutely brilliant to have your support, and wish you well in your recovery from everything that's been going on in the last few months. But one thing actually that makes me feel hopeful is actually something Melissa said in the chat we had. She was saying maybe a year ago, progress on this topic in the British rowing team would have been for asking for a compost bin in the corner of the team room. But now it feels that any sort of conversation can be had. It comes back to that "can we be radical" point. What athletes talking to coaches, do we have to train like this? Athletes talking to coaches and asking, do we have to go there? Do we have to all fly there for our training camp? And those coaches may not have even thought about this before. So it comes back to the point of athletes being able to speak out more on this, and just hearing someone like Melissa talk in those terms within one Olympic team might make someone else think, wow, we could have those conversations too. And that's where progress starts. And I think that was really useful, Melissa, that point, because I know that people have heard that and have gone away to their teams and thought, look, could we implement some of this as well? So that's definite progress.
Well, time's ticking on now, and I'm going to hand over to Russell in a few minutes just to wrap us up. But one of the most striking things about the production and about the series is that it's kind of interspersed with these moments of beautiful poetry, kind of at the start of each episode and then running through. And I think there's a special edition with just the poems. How did that come about? How did you write those poems, or is this like a hobby, a sideline hobby of yours, or is it a muscle that you've been developing as part of the podcast series?
Well, two things there. There is a hobby. It's not writing poetry as such, but it is writing music. And actually, all the music in the series was written and produced by myself and my musical partner. So that's a little bit of a little nugget that you might not have known there. So, but that's definitely a sideline. But no, in terms of the poems, we wanted to start the series and then start each episode in a really provocative way, but without the use of a conventional presenter, if you like. Now, yes, I did sort of nominally host this series. I'd come on at the start and sort of flag up what we were going to be talking about. But I didn't want to be then sitting there really earnestly with my microphone saying, what is it we can do? Do we realise the threat? And, because it's that sort of earnest nature of the conversation that could make some people turn off, especially right at the very start. So we wanted to pose those questions in a very different way. And we thought actually doing it through this sort of performance poetry would be quite effective. And hopefully it was. We got a couple of great voiceover artists to voice up the poems, Kenny and Cecilia. And as you say, we've for those who haven't got the time to listen to all the episodes in the series, what we've done is edit all the poems together into a bonus episode, and it's only 12 minutes long. So if you only listen to one thing, maybe listen to that. It's just called The Poems, and they're in all their glory.
So that begs the question for Jonathan Overend, musician, poet, climate activist, and occasional sports broadcaster. What's next? Is there a second series, or?
Well, it's funny. I laugh because Charles is on the call, and Charles gave me my first job at the BBC in 1994, and I think one of his questions to me then was, do you want to be the main voice on the BBC, or do you actually want to run the BBC? And I think 21-year-old me actually said, well, I want to do both. And that kind of sums me up in a way, and anyone who's worked with me knows that. And yeah, it is a bit of a failing. I do have lots of strings to my bow, but I enjoy that sort of stuff, and I love nothing better than sitting back at the end of the day and making some music with my mate. It's just a bit of a release. I used to play in bands in London, and now I sort of produce this sort of weird ambient electro cinematic stuff in my bedroom. It's just kind of, we all need something like that, don't we? But anyway, what's the question? What's next? Oh yes, so I've set up this production company. We're called 9419, and basically, as David mentioned earlier, we're in the business of high spec audio and high impact journalism. It's a winning combination. We want to really go to governing bodies or brands or companies and make really great audio content for them that in some respects turns the spotlight on themselves. That's where the journalism comes in. I'm not interested in sort of corporate puffs or doing glorified commercials in an editorial sense, but I am interested in finding out things, and I am interested in learning more about subjects. And I think it can be a really useful way of companies to explore various angles to their operation, turning the spotlight on themselves and saying, are we doing enough here? We think the answer is yes, but let's bring in someone from the outside to find out what they think. So we've got a few interesting projects on the go with that in mind, and yeah, it really sort of plays to what I'm interested in, which is learning more about topics that really matter in life. So hopefully there'll be something else new coming out of our stable sometime soon.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that. We'll be looking forward to that very much. And I think on behalf of everybody on the call, for such an important piece of work and such a beautiful piece of work, I certainly thank you, and I'm sure everybody else echoes that thanks as well. And like I say, I look forward to seeing what's coming next. If you haven't listened to the series, you can find it on any of the podcast providers just by typing in Emergency on Planet Sport, or there's a dedicated website, or you can find, is it Planet Sport Pod on Twitter?
Planet Sport Pod on Twitter and Instagram, absolutely. And as I say, these things do build with time, and when you start something from zero, which is what we've done with this, it is totally reliant on word of mouth. So any sort of spreading of the wings of this project, thanks to you, would be really appreciated.
Well, I'm sure everybody will share it with their friends and colleagues who've been on this call and who's listened to it. All that remains for me to do is to thank you, Jonathan, for not just for the production, but for sparing your time today, and to thank everybody for joining the call. I'm going to hand over to Russell, the CEO, just to close the call with a couple of announcements and a bit of a wrap up. But thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all again next time.
Thanks, Dom, and thanks to you and to Russell and Melissa and everyone else who contributed. You know, I was really grateful for all your support and for all your time, which you gave so willingly. I think Melissa's laptop battery ran out. Such was the length of our conversation on one particular day. But you know, all that time was really gratefully received, and hopefully it will be repaid in this conversation being spread more widely. That's the aim. So thanks, and thanks to everyone on the call. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Over to you, Russ.
Thanks, Dom. I mean, today's all about thanks. I think it's been a fantastic session. Thanks to everybody who's contributed, who didn't necessarily expect that they were going to be asked to say anything. I think it's been really powerful to hear all those testimonies coming through. Thanks to Dom, that was really well hosted, bringing everybody in. And Jonathan, I'm going to add my thanks in as well. I think I said to you by email afterwards that I have never in my life binge watched or listened to anything previously. And I woke up at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning and I listened to one of these, the first episode, and I listened to the whole lot straight through. I did all 8 straight through. It just held me. I sat in this room, our spare bedroom that just turned into my office, and had about a 3/4 of an hour conversation with Jonathan one afternoon. And there was some kind of miraculous alchemy that has just turned that conversation and every other conversation that Jonathan had into something that I genuinely believe at this point in time is the best resource talking about sustainability in general, but specifically climate change and sport. And please encourage as many people as you can to listen to this series. It is phenomenal. It is balanced, but it's urgent as well. And it really explains to anybody who doesn't see this as a priority, they really should be taking this quite seriously. So absolutely pass this on to everybody. And I know it's already been given out on university courses as a resource for people to listen to. I did some lectures last week, and the key thing that other lecturers have said is listen to this series. And I encourage people to do so as well.
Wow, I'll invoice them. Thank you, Russell. I appreciate that. And again, you know, like I said to Dom and Melissa, thanks to you for all your support, and everything that you said in the course of that 45-minute conversation helped inform me in my conversations with others as well. So it was just really great for me to have that wide perspective early on, and really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, this is going to be available on the website fairly soon, this conversation. So if there are people who you feel would benefit from it, who've missed it, then we'll send the link to you. Feel free to send it to them. If there's anything from today's discussion that you want to follow up on, you can contact us through the website. Please feel free to do so. We'd love to hear from you. And there'll be webinars going forward into the future, and we'll send you all the details of all of them. Thanks very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.